So the way we're going to work this is that the principal author of this report, who is Ari Perdana, Senior Evaluation Specialist in IED, will give just about a 10-minute presentation of the main findings of this report. And we're very happy that two colleagues from ADB have agreed to comment on from their perspectives. Cigdem Akin, who is director at PSMG, will comment from the point of view of the operational issues that have been raised. And John Beirne, principal economist at ERDI, of course, will give an assessment of Ari's economic analysis. So with that, then we'll open it up for questions and answers from all of you from the floor and those, many of you who are online. I want to thank you all for coming. It's a very busy time for ADB, given the annual meetings coming up and board meetings that are being squeezed in. But we hope that you find this session constructive. So Ari, over to you.
Thank you, Manny, and thank you, everyone. So in ADB, when we talk about DRM, it could mean at least two things. First is disaster risk management. And the second is, of course, this paper, Domestic Resource Mobilization. So today's discussion will be resourceful rather than risky, I assume. So this paper is not an evaluation of ADB's DRM support. It is indeed a scoping and stock-taking exercise, looking at how ADB defines and approaches DRM, the portfolio size, and what that means for our future work. So let me start by illustrating how we evaluators are facing challenge in identifying ADB's DRM portfolio. So we have some loans that are quite straightforward because the term domestic resource mobilization or resource mobilization are in the title. In some loans, in some project documents, the keyword related to DRM are in the background documents, but we need still to make sure that it's basically the aim of the operations. It mentioned in the policy reforms, actions, or in the DMF. While in some other cases, DRM-related keywords are mentioned as in the background, but the operation itself is not particularly supporting DRM. It could support general PFM reforms or other objectives. So it means that having DRM-specific language in the document doesn't mean that the operations are providing specific DRM support. So in those cases, we have to look closely at the project documents. And this is what we aim to do in this paper. So that challenges is what motivated the paper. Despite ADB's intention to scale up DRM support under Strategy 2030, identifying what counts as domestic resource mobilization in practice is still not straightforward. So the paper is trying to address the following questions. How does ADB frame its DRM support in the corporate and country strategies? The paper discusses this, but for the interest of time, I will skip this discussion and focus on the next two questions, which are how large is ADB portfolio in DRM, and what area of DRM support that ADB provides most. As a note, DRM can be defined in a broad way, which can include, for example, SOE reforms or capital market development. But in this paper, we follow a narrower definition of DRM, focusing only on government revenues from tax or non-tax sources. We also limit the analysis to operations approved since 2011, so it consistent with more recent strategic frameworks. So John will discuss broader issues on DRM from the macroeconomic perspective, and Cigdem will present the perspective from ADB operation and support. At least that's the game plan for today. So I'll jump to how we try to identify ADB's DRM portfolio, especially in the older years. So once again, the purpose of this topical paper is to propose a methodology that is transparent, replicable, and scalable for future analytical and evaluation works. So to do that, we try to apply a consistent criteria. We apply a multi-step document analysis, starting by focusing only on PSM loans and grants, because this is where ADB has typically provided DRM support. That said, we understand that ADB also provides DRM support under other sectors. For example, there's a lot of support for municipal government revenues under the urban operations, or natural resource taxation under energy sectors. But in this exercise, we focus more on the procedure rather than expanding the scope. Next, we exclude some modalities and activities where revenue mobilization is not primary objectives. We also exclude some areas, for example, PPPs, SOE reforms, or capital market development to be consistent with the narrow definition of DRM that we follow. Next, after we identify a workable list of project documents, we apply document analysis. We try to see whether specific keywords are included in the DMF or policy reforms in the documents. So we want to ensure that the DRM is a focus of the programs rather than just background references. Here is a list of keywords that we use in the analysis. Sorry, maybe it's too small, but it's on the paper, so it's an incentive for you to read the papers. So we started from a longer list of keywords, but after we piloted the search, some keywords were never used, so we focus on this refined set of keywords. So applying that methodology, we identify 55 PSM loans and grants with strong DRM components. That amounts to 5.8 billion over the period of 2011 to 22, or about 3% of ADB's total lending over this period. That means that DRM is part of ADB support, but it's still a relatively small share of overall operations. So a few important caveats to mention. First, as we mentioned, this approach underestimates DRM support under the other sectors, like energy or urban sectors. At the same time, this may also be overestimating DRM support, because typically under PSM operations, DRM is only one focus out of broader reform packages. So we actually don't know yet how much of this amounts really went to DRM support. And then we further dissected the characteristic of the identified portfolio. Southeast Asia accounts for the largest share by value, but part received the highest number of loans and grants. DRM support encompassed both tax policy and tax reform supports. Tax policy and tax administration reform supports. So tax policy, most of the tax policy support are around VAT or excise tax, to some extent, sales tax, not so much on personal income tax. For tax administration, most of the support focus on increasing customers' compliance. So it means that ADB support for DRM basically focus more on the efficiency dimension of DRM, in particular collection, not so much on equity or progressivity dimensions. Then we did the same thing for TA and identified 41 DRM-focused TA projects amounting to 46.1 million, or about 2.3% of ADB TA portfolio over the period. That was our time frame until 2022, but we also understand and we acknowledge that ADB's DRM portfolio has expanded since 2023. So in the past 2 years, from 2023 until 2025, ADB has approved 21 DRM-related loans and grants of 3.2 billion. And I think after that, there are at least 2 more loans have been approved. 12 standalone TA for 11 million. As a note, we got this number from the sector group. So, and we did not do any further analysis on this newer portfolio. So it means that we cannot treat the two sets of portfolio as comparable or under a consistent time series. But this is just to illustrate that there has been a consistent and conscious effort in ADB to push more DRM support. To wrap up, here are some key takeaways from the paper. Across Asia and the Pacific, DRM has improved, but some important gaps remain. Around a quarter of ADB DMCs still have a tax to GDP ratio below 15%. And those who are above this threshold, many of them are facing stagnating or declining revenue collection. ADB has been increasing its focus on DRM, not only in volume, but also in terms of perspective. But as a caveat, more complex design and implementation challenges are still lies ahead. It means stronger coordination among ADB experts within ADB and with DMCs and with development partners are still needed. So translating commitment into coherence in DRM portfolio is still the challenge for ADB. And this paper recommends 5 areas that ADB could work on. First is greater clarity on what counts of DRM support, improve results tracking, stronger partnerships, better alignment between DRM support and cross-cutting priorities such as climate finance, and also tailoring DRM support to diverse country contexts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ari, for giving a very crisp and succinct summary of the paper. Can I turn over to Chinam for her perspectives from the operational side?
Thank you very much. This is a very important publication. In fact, as PSMG, we host the Asia Pacific Tax Hub. So across all of our PFM-related interventions, public sector management-related interventions, we do incorporate domestic resource mobilization as an important reform component, particularly on tax reforms, tax policy reforms, automation, efficiency enhancements. Across all of our DMCs, we invest heavily in improving those systems. So in this particular presentation, I'd like to highlight, the tagging is very, very important. And you have rightly pointed out, perhaps we're not capturing all the DRM-related information enough in our work. So I think we should collectively work in this direction, like what are the best ways to tag this from the get-go, from the concept node stage. And of course, there are different types of DRM interventions. We have to also acknowledge that tax policy is one dimension, but we may have other source of domestic resource mobilization, including expenditure efficiency, including, even capital markets itself can be a domestic resource mobilization. That's a different aspect. And broader PFM reforms also result in resource mobilization for the countries. So this tagging aspect is very important, and we should work on better methodology. So if I may, I'd like to also talk about, using DRM, domestic resource mobilization strategically, because we shouldn't just be raising taxes, because since Ibn Khaldun's times, right, there's this famous Laffer curve also, the more you tax, the more you choke the economy. That's not what we want. We have to use tax policy, tax as a strategic tool. So it's pretty important that we should first and foremost look at how we can broaden the tax base in the country, because our DMCs have a lot of informal, huge informal sectors. Tax evasion, avoidance is a major problem. This informality also leads to other types of distortions. And we should therefore aspire more for closing these loopholes. And oftentimes, as part of the political economy considerations, a lot of tax exemptions, subsidies, and those types of preferential treatment are given to certain groups. That also results in suboptimal domestic resource mobilization. So first and foremost, I think our reforms should begin with expanding the tax base, closing these loopholes, finding better ways to collect taxes, and building that civic culture is also important. We should invest in those first. And also revenue neutral improvements are very critical. Even some efficiency gains, automation using digital tools can translate into big gains. One case in point, in the past, I personally worked on that project in Maldives. The introduction of digital tax reforms made a huge difference. It's a geographically challenged country, so the moment you introduce online filing, it made a huge difference in overall tax collection. So these education of taxpayers, online platforms, they can be quite a game changer. Another aspect is, of course, progressivity is very important and targeting is very important. We should focus on growth enhancing tax reforms as opposed to those that will contract the economy. And it will be critical that we give the right type of tax incentives to MSMEs or growth generating sectors. We can waive vulnerable groups from taxation for social inclusion purposes. So this progressivity element is very important. And of course, political economy dimension is such that often the wealthiest pay the least tax, right? They can find ways to get away with it. So how do you close those loopholes are very important. And also we should tailor or tax systems to capture the informal sectors. Often indirect taxes are a good way of capturing taxation that goes through the informal sector, but we have to be careful about the progressivity element. We don't want to penalize poor and vulnerable groups that are consuming the same basket as the rich, right, by putting too much indirect taxes. I think another critical dimension I would like to mention is that domestic resource mobilization can also help us better contain economic shocks or maybe incentivize certain behavior. These sin taxes, right, like cigarettes, healthcare related taxes is one way to change behavior. And of course, if we want to incentivize more green transition, we can use tax policy strategically to cut fuel consumption or to incentivize more greener solutions. So I think domestic resource mobilization is a huge field. If we do it right, it can lead to very impactful changes in the economies. I'll stop here, but more Q&A, I'll answer the other questions.
Thank you very, very much, Cigdem, for a really nice overview of the kinds of modalities that we're trying to promote in our DMCs. So I'll turn it over to John now, but please keep in mind your questions because after that we'll turn it over to the audience. So John, over to you.
Thank you, Manny, and thanks for the introduction or for the invitation to this session today. So from the ERDI perspective, this issue is something that we've been looking at for many years. Going back to 2022, we had a theme chapter in the ADO, which comprehensively looked at the factors driving DRM across our region. Many of those issues are still valid today, of course, and it's an issue that we are continually updating. With these remarks, I would like to spend a few minutes talking about differences in tax revenue performance in the region across economies, and the factors that are behind that. And I will draw upon some of the research that we've carried out to inform these comments. As has been explained by Ari, there is variation even within our region in terms of tax to GDP ratios. What we've seen is that lower income economies tend to have lower tax to GDP revenue when we look at the data. There are a number of reasons behind that. Cigdem has talked about some of those, including informality, but also narrow tax bases are a key contributory factor, as well as weak administration. So there are clear implications for policy in this regard. In terms of the revenue sources, the types of taxes that are used, I think it's been touched upon that these are sort of consumption heavy. So we're looking at VAT, excise duties, for example. These are broadly used, easily implementable, easy to administer, and that's one of the factors behind that. But I think it's problematic when we consider the potential regressivity of those. And in order to counter that, it's important to have appropriate measures in place to offset that and make it a little bit more progressive. That's one of the challenges we face, particularly for low-income economies. Personal income tax remains very limited, I would say, compared to advanced economies, for example, and this is also due to informality and narrow formal employment, again, pointing to policies that could encourage more formality in the business sector. Property and wealth taxes also underutilized, and they can be a potential source of revenue in that regard. I think, when we look at other factors that could contribute to greater tax revenue, we find that those economies that have better digital tax systems, formal employment, and more diversified economic bases are those that have stronger revenue. So this is important as well. Not having over-reliance on a particular sector also increases the resilience to external shocks, as has been touched upon. Some economies have taken on and implemented very important reforms on compliance. But again, I think this is something that needs further work on, particularly for those economies that are at the lower end of the scale, let's say, in terms of tax revenue generation. And it's important more broadly to build up fiscal space, particularly at the current juncture when economies are facing these types of external shocks. So, the importance of DRM really needs to be highlighted, and that's why this is more than just a topical paper. I think it's a crucial area that we need to further. So there are a number of constraints which I've already touched upon. One that has not been mentioned yet is trust, essentially. And really aligning expenditure with the revenue. And this is something that can help to foster trust as well. So, aligning tax revenue systems, tax revenue plans with expenditure plans as well, and broader development goals. This is very important for the credibility of plans that would be in place to increase revenue, and therefore the effectiveness, therefore the trust. So I think this is another important factor. Let me just close with a couple of points on policy design. So I think when we talk about tax revenue, we typically think of what type of policy should we bring in, what type of tax instrument should we use. But I think that's only one side of the story. An important factor, a key factor, in fact, is the institutional setup, the structural constraints within economies. I've talked about some of those already. And I think, with both of those factors working together, so taxes that are introduced progressively, even those that are perhaps more consumption heavy, which are, these are needed, for many economies, but it's important to lay in place controls that ensure that, that the vulnerable are not disproportionately affected, let's say. And I think that's, appropriate policy-based lending can help to address those institutional, those structural constraints that can really unleash the policies to have an even greater impact. Yeah, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Great. No, thank you very much for those, both of you, for really insightful comments. Let me now open the floor for any questions or comments that people might have, either online or here in the room. Was there someone online?
Yorda, thank you. Thank you for the paper. I'm just kind of thinking about a country's journey towards upper middle income and then wealthy countries. Does how a country best takes tax evolve as the country evolves as well? And you mentioned before that personal tax was quite low, but in developed countries it's quite high. Is there a kind of a natural progression of the mix of taxes? Do they evolve at the same time as a country evolves and gets wealthier? Is there an optimal mix of tax that changes over time? Kia ora.
Thank you. I think I can see that institutional and structural development and capacity, especially in the Ministry of Finance or Tax Department, plus the digitalization can make the revenue or income collection better. But the digitalization is quite expensive and high cost of investment for the government. And I think somehow if the government cannot collect tax and then they cannot invest more, and then the cycle is going down. So I think at this area, ADB can jump in and support the cycle to make it better by providing more fund and make the country invest in this digitalization. But my question is for the institutional building and capacity building on tax system in different countries, different type of challenges. I would like to hear from your experience on each country or some region that they may have different problem in this kind of area. And of course, the mobilization in different region might have different challenges. I mean, hear from you some experiences on different challenges in this area of the mobilization. Thank you.
Okay. Sean, and then we'll take another round.
Thanks very much. Very interesting subject. One question for Ari and one for Jiren and John, perhaps. Ari, it wasn't clear, unless I missed it, whether when you set out the broad numbers that we've invested. I know there's, it's perhaps an overinflated number, but is there a trend over time, not just over that period, but have we actually increased our investment in domestic resource mobilization in an appreciable manner? Question for John and Jiren is, I mean, I'm often surprised by how low the revenue bases are for a lot of our countries. Is there any trend over the long term in that as well? And you would expect to see that grow up to a certain point. Ultimately, obviously, it's probably largely a social choice, a political choice. Societies decide what the level is and how they want to use what they want to tax within that. So ultimately, I guess it's a political choice. To some extent, it must be just simply to do with capacity, weak capacity. But you would expect over a long period of time, in most of our countries, that should have increased. And so are we seeing any positive trend in the aggregate? I also wondered whether we have a playbook in ADB when we're doing diagnostics or program design as to an ideal. Do we have a template for guiding how we engage and support countries in this? In Jiren, you talked about different choices, and I think the optimal approach generally is you want to have a broad base and lower rates, but then if you're trying to also use it to encourage certain behaviors that can act against that. So do we have an approach that we favor? Finally, just natural resource rich economies. I don't know whether you looked at natural resource royalties and rents and so on in your work, but I expect that'll become a growing importance as we get into critical minerals and sectors like that. Thanks.
And why don't we stop here, and I'll turn it over to the panel. I think there were a set of questions, particularly to John and Cigdem, I think, on this issue of the natural evolution, the kinds of taxes that we can collect, and how that's transpired. I think both Sean and Lou raised that. There was a question of capacity building and how to build that up, and also whether there's any variation across different regions, sub-regions in Asia. And finally, this natural resource tax. So first, John, over to you, and then
Thanks for these questions. On the first question around personal income tax and whether we see some sort of a trend towards different types of taxes as an economy will become more developed, for example. Well, certainly we see that there are lower personal income taxes compared to advanced economies. And one of the factors behind that, as I sort of alluded to earlier, is around the informal employment in developing compared to advanced economies. And as one would become more developed, it follows that there would be more coming from personal income tax. So I think one of the natural implications of that is that how would we make or how do we incentivize a shift to the formal business sector? And this is something that we talk about all the time at ADB. Providing access to finance, reducing the burden, improving compliance, and these types of issues can be important in that. I think it still remains the case that consumption heavy sort of taxes are dominant in developing economies. So I think it follows that as one would become more developed, there would be scope for moving towards perhaps more progressive types of taxes. That's what I would say on that. Would you like to add to that?
Yeah. First of all, I personally don't agree that investment in digital systems are expensive. Actually, it's a good bang for the buck. We don't spend like hundreds of millions of dollars to build a digital system to collect taxes. It's actually quite low. But what you get in the end is very impactful. So with the $20-30 million investment max, you can build a fairly robust digital tax administration system, including audit frameworks, risk-based audits, like different types of analytics you can incorporate in these. So it's actually ADB should invest more this type of projects to be able to reap the most benefits. So it's not an expensive investment at all, actually. And when I was outposted in Uzbekistan, I had a lot of chance to interact with the tax committee, and they have themselves using in-house resources invested in these digital tax collection platforms. It was quite mind-boggling what you can do with it. Even at the district level, they track the businesses, they have apps, they have risk-based audit. The inspector network is very clearly captured in the system. They have benchmarks and KPIs for tax auditors. So it's really an enforcement issue, actually, how good the tax collection is and what citizens think about taxation is really starts at the top with the political will. If the government wants to take it seriously, they can invest in these systems and they can enforce the laws in a very uniform manner, transparent manner to change the behavior. If we don't see it, we don't see the results that we want to get, right? If you give lots of tax exemptions, a lot of loopholes, and at the end of the day, there are tax amnesties and there's never predictability, then you invite the behavior of tax evasion and avoidance. So I think enforcement is the key to get a success in the DRM.
On this question, especially John, on informality, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, isn't it? On the one hand, people may not have an incentive to be in the formal sector because they'll see themselves being taxed and being subject to it. Are there ways, for example, even if you have an informal setting, maybe through technology, maybe through presumptive taxes, that would lead them in that direction so that you can show if you pay tax, you actually get some benefits from it? What is the experience with it?
Well, there's a lot of research done in this area. And as I mentioned earlier, I think the provision of access to finance is one of the key incentives for a shift to the formal sector. But of course, it would obviously depend on other factors around compliance, around trust in the government, or also around the effectiveness of the expenditure side as well. So that's why I talked about earlier, if the public, including firms, if they believe that revenue generated is actually spent in an effective way, then they are more likely to be, satisfied to engage in that tax system. And that can also be helpful in this shift towards the formal sector. To just pick up on the other question that we had around, whether there has been any change in tax revenue over the last few years, for example, there has been a slight increase compared to before the pandemic at the regional level, some variation again across different economies. So there has been a slight increase. And also some analysis that we have carried out previously shows that some economies have greater capacity for revenue generation than others. I talked about some of those factors that can help to realize some of that capacity. So reducing the gap between actual and potential tax revenue. And that can be one of the factors, again, which can inform the types of policies that we should be implementing to close that revenue actual versus capacity or potential tax revenue gap. And that would help to increase these revenue rates as well.
From either of you in the natural resource taxation and as a source, especially in some of our countries?
Well, I would just make the point that our research shows that it's important to have a well-diversified economic base in terms of sectors. And, this helps to reduce vulnerability, reduce dependence on specific sectors. So this is important for the stability of revenue over time. It's important for also for equity reasons as well. So I think this is something that we should be looking at. Of course, when you have a very strong particular sector, this can be good. That's great in good times. But what happens when there would be a downturn in that particular sector? You would suffer significantly, substantially in terms of revenue losses. So it's important to diversify. I mean, this is very clear.
Yes, with resource-based economies, perhaps we can think of this as a long-term investment. Sovereign wealth funds are very critical, right? Like if you're extractive industry dependent economy, those resources are finite. They won't last forever. So the governments should be, building the rainy day funds or sovereign wealth funds, using the royalties or tax revenues coming from these mines, and then try to use those funds to diversify the economy. I mean, a lot of countries try to do that. Azerbaijan as a sovereign wealth fund, many other countries in Pacific and others. Some do it better than the others, actually. We have to use this natural resources smartly. They generate a windfall gain, but at the end of the day, they're finite resources. What you do with that, you can try to build the human capital, social safety nets, and then try to diversify the economies. I mean, in the Gulf countries, we've seen they've been trying to do that, right? Investing heavily in tourism, service sector, and so on, like Dubai and etc. That could be kind of successful model. They can try to use these funds to generate a long-term growth prospects.
Specific question on trends in the.
So short answer is no. We don't see increasing trend over the period that we analyze. It's fluctuating across the years, but in general, we didn't see a trend. We didn't see an increasing trend. But yeah, what we noticed is after 2022, starting 2023, there was a conscious effort within ADB to improve the volume of DRM portfolio. So that's the only trend that we've seen so far.
Thanks. So we'll take in some other questions. There are a couple here. So Ludovine here, and then Carrie, do you have a question?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon. Very useful conversation. I would have two questions. Actually, I have many questions, but I will only raise two of them. First one related to what you have just said, Ari. So since 2023, we can see that there is a conscious effort within ADB to increase the portfolio. How do we compare with other MDBs in that regard? Where do we stand? Do you know? And the other question is actually related to what you mentioned, Mani, at the beginning of this meeting. You said that there is no sufficient activity to have a non-topical paper from IED, so it's a real paper or a real evaluation from IED. I mean, when do you think that I mean, how will you define the fact that we have sufficient activity to have such paper? Thank you.
Thanks. So I was struck by Cigdem's comment about the incentives for behavior change. And I was thinking back to sort of a lot of work that I've seen when I worked for the UK government at DFID around good governance, tax collection and behavioral sciences and economics. Similarly, linked to this question, the World Bank Embed unit is doing a lot of stuff around nudges and other sorts of behavioral insight sorts of interventions to persuade citizens not only to comply, but actually to, as much as you can, get people excited about paying their taxes, to realize that being a good citizen is a social good. And I wondered whether ADB has done any work around that intersection between behavioral insights and tax.
Right. Thank you. Very interesting. And yeah, it's a little bit tagging on questions that we already had. But yeah, on the one hand, you said that you didn't really see a trend. It was a relatively small portfolio, but it was a conscious effort. So what's an interesting question for me then is, to what extent is this relatively low portion a question of we didn't focus enough as ADB on this, or there is no demand for these services from our DMCs? And yeah, thinking in that progression, as they become more developed, and you would like to see progressive taxes that tackle inequalities, they also become less reliant on us. So to the extent, to what ability do we have then to promote such tax reform, which is often also strongly related with vested interests that may actually limit the demand? So I would be interested.
Look, thanks, Gareth Kilroy from IED. Just a question on to the panel on ADB support for domestic resource mobilization to municipalities, sort of subnational. Sometimes when we're evaluating urban projects that are non-revenue generating, like a flood risk management, is that the municipality's capacity to raise revenue is critical for O&M. So just wondering what our footprint is in that space.
Okay, so we'll take these questions, unless there's anything online for now. There's nothing yet. Okay, so Cigdem, over to you first.
On the awareness building or educating the taxpayers, yes, we do this type of things in our programs, like taxpayer awareness campaigns. They're embedded in some of the reforms, like tax authorities. We work with them to do these type of activities. I remember I read one World Bank project where they built tax clinics in Mexico, for example, like in each and every neighborhood on certain locations. There were mobile or stationary tax clinics. We can introduce similar approaches. And of course, digitization helps because you can have call centers. I worked on a project in Bhutan back in the days where we set up actually a call center for the tax authority. We also invested heavily on their RAMIS system, Revenue Administration Management Information System, and we trained the call center service providers. Q&A sheet was created during the peak times. They were answering questions. So those type of things we can definitely do, and we are doing in our projects to build that civic culture. You can use TV ads or other multimedia to make tax paying cool, right? Something you're proud of. But again, this type of mentality needs to develop. I mean, this civic culture. And again, transparency, where the funds go, as you rightly pointed out, if the governance is weak, if the perception of corruption is there, if the service delivery is not good and people generally don't trust the government delivering services, they don't want to pay taxes. They feel that this will be wasted, right? So we have to break that perception. So all of the tax reforms, therefore, should come with other expenditure related reforms, service delivery reforms, G2C services. Those centers are also critical. I mean, it's an ecosystem, revenue side and spending side, and building the trust by the citizens. On the user fees, yes, that's an important question. Thank you. At the subnational level, we also work with municipal taxes, for example. Yesterday, we had an IBS on our Nepal program, and it's a federal structure. And last year, we had a PFM-related PBL there, where we focused on property tax collection at the subnational level. When we work with SOEs or utilities, for example, we also focus on user fee collection. It's kind of taxation also, right? And there's a lot of issues in especially South Asian countries with the user fee collection, water, electricity, and so on. So again, same approach can be applied there, that informing citizens, and they should feel that they get something in return, right? By paying taxes, if they can demonstratively see that municipal services get better or their water provision is more stable, electricity access improves, then they will feel that they can contribute in paying. But if that service doesn't come, then nobody wants to pay for it.
Do you have a view on whether or not on this demand issue, are DMCs, Cigdem, asking for this kind of support to build domestic resource mobilization capability?
Definitely. I mean, especially on automation systems, they are asking for that. It's becoming, I mean, people are learning, right, from each other. South-South cooperation, they go and they see that, of course, all governments need revenue, and the easiest place to raise revenue is from within the economy rather than external borrowing. So this, there's a huge demand, certainly.
John?
You have covered the point well. I would just mention a couple of other issues. One would be on, how can we best introduce systems that can increase DRM without distorting other parts of the economy, notably, vulnerable groups and MSMEs in particular. And I think, one issue we touched on was the importance of broadening the tax base as opposed to just raising rates. But I think another important point is on sequencing and how this framework would be rolled out. Digitalization is an important aspect, of course. It can help with compliance, but there are significant constraints around capacity for many economies, I would say. So that's another thing to be taken into account.
The comparison with excuse me, the other MDB. So in this paper, we did not make systematic analysis on the comparison. But what I can say is, if we compare it to the World Bank, so the World Bank has had like 2 or 3 years earlier in terms of increasing in terms of the portfolio. Although once again, we did not analyze whether it's due to the overall size of the World Bank compared to ADB, or was it really a trend? But what is interesting is IEG of the World Bank published their own evaluation, not just paper evaluation on domestic resource mobilization within the World Bank group, and they also face the same issues on tagging and classification of what constitutes of DRM. So I guess John, and this is also an issue not only within ADB but overall. But this relates to next questions by Michael and then Gareth. So on the demand and supply, again, we were not able to test whether there was a demand, significant demand from DMC or not. But from literature, DMCs may ask for help, support from ADB to the World Bank, mostly on capacity development on administration, but not so much on tax policy, especially on how to increase the tax rate, something like that. It's very politically sensitive and the constraint is bigger. So that's also the type of request that we receive from the MDB. But from the supply side, I mean, from our operation side, not only in ADB, but the whole development world, the concept of DRM itself, it's relatively new. I think it started to kick off from Addis Ababa commitment. I think it was around 2009. Of course, IMF, World Bank has supported tax reforms, and we also support tax reforms in a long time ago. But framing it under DRM and why DRM is important, basically starting 2009, 2010, and that after that cascading down to our operations. But it took a while since Addis 2009 until we seen some trends in supporting DRM in DRM support. So that's also interesting to analyze within institutions like us, whether the trend was really driven by demand, but I think it's also mostly driven by supply in terms of how we frame these issues around our operations. Garrett, just quickly on municipal taxes. Yes, we also mentioned in the paper that we acknowledge ADB is supporting municipal government revenues. It's strategically excluded in this paper, in this analysis, but there is something that we can also scale up after we've developed this procedure and analysis. So hopefully that we could also include those kind of support in the next work.
Thanks. Just Garrett, on your point, I mean, when I was working on urban issues many years ago, resource mobilization in cities is one of the most complex things because property taxes are in a way an ideal tax because the factor doesn't move. Okay, it's land. It would be great if we could tax it. It's very efficient. And probably actually quite progressive if you can tax it well. The problem is institutionally, it's exceedingly difficult because when you have informality in the housing sector, it is very difficult to do the cadastral surveys and everything else. And that requires a very, very long-term commitment in low capacity country. I have
I have a comment on this point. Yes, we worked on that actually GIS-based mapping and property taxation in several countries. Our urban colleagues are also working, but the PSMG also worked. So it's not as difficult as you think actually. With
this was back in the 1980s. So
yeah, maybe back then. So I would agree. I mean, 40 years ago, probably it was tough. At 45, but nowadays, nowadays these especially satellite images, GIS-based mapping, it made life a little easier. In Bhutan, I recall that I worked on that project. We developed a methodology to synthesize different ways of capturing property tax values. I mean, there are various ways, right? As a property that used to be outside of city premises, as the city expands, it's now within that. And then you can always look at the market sales price, or you can just basically build basic valuation as per, let's say, zoning. You can do that. You can even do anonymous surveys, buyers and sellers and things like that, or the banks when they lend the money, how much they charge for that property. So there are various ways to capture the current market prices. And it's a matter of indexation, and it's a matter of upgrading it within the systems. And in Bhutan, we built that, again, MIS system, where you can update that data, and every year the property owners get a notification and they end up paying it. So there are now digital tools which can make life easier, and we can tie utility or other services to property taxation. So that's an incentive for people to properly pay their taxes. So yeah, now tools are available.
It's so good to hear that things have changed since I was a kid. But I think the one thing still is probably going to be an issue are property rights. When you have squatters and big communities where insecure and uncertain property rights, I imagine that's less of a technical issue and more of institutional. So I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. Just a few concluding words. I think this has been immensely helpful. Certainly, one big takeaway for me is the need for us to remember that domestic resource mobilization cannot be divorced from effective public expenditures. That one affects the other. And that's a reminder for all of us that it has to be on both sides. The other is that technical issues have really helped. So in many respects, this is less of an excuse, but the institutional dimension is something that we still have to work on. Perhaps nudges might work, but I think deeper behavioral change is going to be required to get this done. Just one last thing, Ludovic, and I didn't mean to, when is it that we can evaluate DRM formally? I'm actually surprised, a 3 to 5% portfolio, that's about the same as the education and health. Yeah, so I think that perhaps in a couple of years' time, this would be a ripe topic for a full-fledged evaluation. So with that, please join me in thanking my great panel and all of you for a wonderful discussion. Thank you.